Johns is an American comic book writer who works primarily for DC Comics. He started out working for Richard Donner, who's the director of the original Superman movie. And Richard Donner worked with DC on comic books, and Geoff Johns sort of worked as an assistant for Richard Donner and worked at DC as an assistant for a couple of other writers as well. So he started working for the writer of The Flash, Fastest Man Alive, and Justice Society, which were two, I would say, minor comics in the late 90s and early 2000s. But he did a lot of good when he was on the team, and in fact he got closer and closer to being the primary writer on both of those comic books. Justice Society in particular, he eventually took over from the original writer and was writing most of the stories himself, and he basically created a bit of a name for himself internally at DC Comics. So eventually they gave him a chance and they gave him Teen Titans, which up until that point hadn't really been doing much. It had been sort of expanding and expanding and expanding, and each new iteration was like more and more minor characters. So when he came on board, and this was in the sort of early 2000s, he overhauled the whole thing. He just ripped the whole thing apart, started from scratch. He took the basic, most important characters from the DC universe that were teenagers, put them back together, and then he created this brand new story. And this is kind of the genius of Geoff Johns, is he essentially made the whole thing an origin story, except that it was 25 years into an already existing mythology. But when you read it, you feel like it's a completely brand new, fresh start origin, which is crazy. So he reintroduced each villain one by one. So you get Brother Blood again, you get Deathstroke again, you get a couple of others, the demon that I can't remember. But the point is that he had this way of freshening up the whole thing and making it seem like it was brand new, even though you already knew all the characters like Superboy, Connor Kent, and Tim Drake, Robin, and a couple of the others. He also did this thing where he made it more realistic, and obviously, you know, it's like a huge fantasy, science fiction, whatever. It's definitely a comic, but there's a much more realistic kind of twist on the idea. That's what he brought to it. I mean, with Teen Titans in particular, it was like a teen drama. These were like teenagers acting just like teenagers, and the story of their arguments and the emotions that they have is a bigger part of the story arc than the villain that they're fighting. So he did really well on Teen Titans, and then I can't remember which came first, whether it was Green Lantern or Infinite Crisis, but basically around the same time he got given Green Lantern, which was huge, and he also got given the big summer event, which is a massive thing for any writer, especially a primary DC or Marvel comic book writer. They want to be in charge of the big summer event. So with Green Lantern, the character was dead. It had been Hal Jordan had been killed off in the I think 99 or maybe 2000. He hadn't had his own comic for a very long time. He'd been lumped in with Green Arrow for years, or just put into the Justice League comic. So the whole thing it needed freshening up, and the way he did it, nobody expected. Again, he wiped the slate clean. He came up with a whole massive new thing. He turned the whole thing into this epic science fiction fantasy like he'd never seen before. He didn't just reintroduce the character, he changed the entire past. He made everything brand new. But the best thing about it was, rather than just cherry picking from modern DC history, which is what a lot of other writers did, he took Alan Moore's origins, Alan Moore's stories from back in the late 80s, and used them as his origin of the DC universe, which nobody had ever really thought to do before, I guess. And I mean, Alan Moore, because he's so angry with people ever touching any of his work, I guess people just thought to just leave it alone. But the way that Geoff Johns did it was absolutely an homage. And in Infinite Crisis, which was his other big triumph, which is 2005, he cherry-picked from Marv Wolfman's original Crisis on Infinite Earths, and also Alan Moore's different stories, his whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. There's kind of elements of that in there, mainly for the Man Who Has Everything, and the Green Lantern stories that he wrote. He threw all that into the mix and kind of made all these strong references to truly great, well-respected stories, but also created his own incredible story. Infinite Crisis is absolutely fantastic. Turned the DC universe on its head, re-established all of these rules, and this was a relatively new writer to the pool. He wasn't a seasoned DC writer, like not a seasoned A-list DC writer, but he was now. So Green Lantern just became solid, and it went on to become one of the primary DC comic books because of Geoff Johns. So from that point onwards, he basically had much more power to make his own decisions. So he'd always been a huge fan of Superman, had always wanted to write for Action Comics. Eventually he got to do that. He had a really short run on there, which I really have a huge problem with, because I think he could have done really well. I wish they'd let him write on there longer. I don't know if it was his decision or somebody else's, but he only ever released, I think it's 4 story arcs, but they were all absolutely amazing, and they were all just as good as his Green Lantern run. He then finally got the Flash, which was another character he'd always wanted. Again, he relaunched Flash with Flash Rebirth, which is so incredible. And again, he kind of got the ball rolling with that, but only did 3 volumes, like 3 story arcs with that before he went off of it. And again, he could have done so well. He could have gone to 50 issues with both of those comics, but he didn't. But then on the other hand, I'm guessing like his work, he was in high demand, and he was doing a lot of different things. He did 2 summer events. I think he ended up doing 3 summer events in total. His Green Lantern thing took all time. So eventually it got to the point where they decided just to relaunch. So he'd put a lot of ideas in place which were kind of swept aside for the New 52 relaunch. But the New 52, I believe, is 100% designed with him right at the helm of the whole thing. So even though it might not have been part of his original plan, this whole new universe is very much down to him. He was given a promotion to be creative director at DC, which basically means he's in charge of the fantasy universe. It all comes down to him. He wrote the relaunch story, and then he is still writing the flagship story, which is Justice League. So he's a really great writer, somebody who I really respect, and this is my Geoff Johns collection.
So first off, we've got the Teen Titans, starting obviously with the first issue, which is a kids' game. If you don't get any, just get this one. It is a really good story. It's a great origin for the Teen Titans. So he went on to do, I think, 5 or 6 volumes. I bought 5, including the Teen Titans Outsiders um, kind of shared crossover comic, which is alright. It's pretty good. It's not great, but it's part of the story. If you're into the story, it works really well. So then I've got like a Crisis section, starting with the original Marv Wolfman's Crisis on Infinite Earths. I've chucked those in there just to keep the series together at 0 hour, which is rubbish. So there was a whole prelude thing to Infinite Crisis. The one that Geoff wrote is this one for JLA, Crisis of Conscience, which ties up events from Identity Crisis, which is pretty good, by Brad Meltzer, and Infinite Crisis. Um, so yeah, it's kind of. I think I would recommend that one. So then, because I was really into Infinite Crisis, I bought all these weird little tie-in things as well, like the Companion and the Prelude. I wouldn't really recommend them; they're not that great. But so this is the actual thing, Infinite Crisis. This is amazing. This is definitely in my top 3 comics of all time. It's so detailed and packed. There's so much going on, and it's all quality. Definitely recommend giving it a read. You do need to read the first one though, Crisis on Infinite Earth, for it to make sense. Okay, so next I got my Green Lantern collection, which is the whole end of the shelf here. So it all kicked off with this one, Rebirth, which is really famous in comics, like for being so good, and it's a great place to start with Green Lantern. He did write an origin, which is a bit later on. It's called Secret Origin, but still, Rebirth is a good place to start. He also rebooted the Green Lantern Corps, which is the sister comic, so this is his. And then all the rest of Green Lantern Corps were written by other people, but I got them all anyway, and I really love Green Lantern Corps. It's amazing. It's like a kind of buddy cop thing in space. So this is the rest of the Green Lantern volumes up to the present. My favourite story arc of the whole series is this, which is the Sinestro Corps War. Um, This is just so amazing, so good. It's funny because that's the pinnacle and it's kind of early on, but it's not that the later stories were bad; they just weren't as good. And probably the most famous part of it was his Blackest Night thing, which he did, which is pretty good. But I don't really like zombies, so it's kind of annoying for me. But there we go. A great run. So during Final Crisis, we should get back to these two, he only wrote a couple of stories. The first one was this, which is very cool. You don't need to know anything about Final Crisis to read it, which is even better, and it's just about the Flash's villains. And the other thing he wrote is my number one favorite Geoff Johns story, which is Legion of Three Worlds. This is so good. This is like a culmination of years of his work. It's got loads of different characters he created, all tied together in this epic story that goes to the end of time. It is so good. Would definitely recommend it. Um, let's see. So he did a couple of runs on Booster Gold, who he's a big fan of. He also wrote the Smallville episode about Booster Gold, but that wasn't really that big a deal. This one's a bit of an earlier one. This was Last Sun, which is a story he did with Richard Donner, and it's a pretty good Superman story. You should check it out. And the cool thing is it comes with these 3D glasses, and the middle bit in the Phantom Zone is all in 3D, so it's kind of cool just for that. So then his Superman arc tied in with loads of other stuff he'd done: Legion of Superheroes, Brainiac, Superman New Krypton, which is really good, and then this, which is great, his rebooting of the origin of Superman. You should definitely check that out. The origin stuff is really easy to read, and it's like a great starting point. And then this is also great. I didn't know anything about the Flash, and I was a bit worried about reading this and not knowing, but it does give you a great introduction to the character, so that's cool. And then his reboot. I don't really like the New 52, and this, I was really unimpressed with this, so it's a shame really, but I got it anyway, obviously. But I haven't bought any more volumes. I've kind of given up after the first one. And then one other thing that I've got of his is this one, Batman Earth 1, which again is a clever story. It's really good, but I don't think he's that good at Batman. But there we go, and it ties in with that one. So there we go, and that's my Geoff Johns collection.